Hello and welcome to another MassMedic webinar. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Today we are joined by our friends at Deloitte, and we're going to be talking about perspectives on everything as a service in MedTech. Before we jump into that content, just a real quick overview of what you can expect today and MassMedic if you're not familiar with us. My name is Nicole Owens. I am the Director of Marketing and Communications for the organization. We are a membership-based trade association that works to bolster the MedTech industry, primarily in New England, through education and connection, so events like this and in-person events, and awareness and advocacy. A few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded, so everyone who registered for it will receive a copy of the recording after the webinar, along with a copy of the slides. And we are going to have time for Q&A. So please make sure to put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer all the questions in the time allotted at the end of the webinar. All right, without further ado, I am pleased to turn it over to our moderator today. Pedro Arbolada is the Managing Director of Deloitte, and he's going to be running the conversation today with a few guests. Pedro.
Thanks very much, Nicole, and welcome everyone. We're excited to be here with you. As the name suggests, we have everything as a service as a topic of the day. In particular, how it's playing it out in MedTech. I brought with me two of my amazing colleagues, Jordan Cole and John Smurl, who will introduce themselves in a second. But just to give you a quick overview of my trajectory, I'm a managing director in Deloitte's strategy consulting practice. I'm part of the MedTech industry practice and have been in MedTech for about 25 years. I live in Boston, and I'm very excited to talk about this everything as a service concept, and in particular how it's playing out in MedTech and the business model innovation that's happening in our industry. So before we dive into the material, we have a full 60 minutes of material, 12 slides. We're going to leave quite a lot of time for Q&A. So as Nicole mentioned, make sure that you put any questions you may have in the Q&A panel. Jordan, do you want to make a quick introduction, and then John?
Sure. Thanks, Pedro. Good morning to everybody that joined us this morning, getting into the afternoon. As Pedro alluded to, Jordan Cole, partner, and I lead our Everything as a Service practice. That practice was originally founded in tech, telecom, and media, and we are now expanding that to other industries. And as Pedro alluded to, we are using that playbook to expand into MedTech and others, and really apply a lot of those lessons learned to other industries to make sure that we're bringing the best thinking, obviously from our lessons learned, and really applying that thinking to new industries, and hopefully you're bringing that business model innovation forward, as Pedro alluded to.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. John, just a quick intro, and then we'll dive into the material.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pedro. So John Smurl, I'm a senior manager, work closely with Jordan and Pedro in kind of our Everything as a Service practice. I focus on kind of the intersection of product strategy and product engineering, and helping companies bring new business models to life and scale them. I've been doing a lot of that work as Jordan has been in the telecom, media, and telecommunications space, and then recently in the past couple of years in the MedTech space. And so really excited to share some of our learnings with you guys today.
Terrific. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jordan. Maybe we go to the material. So like I mentioned, we have quite a number of perspectives on this topic, given our expertise, both in industry and MedTech and elsewhere. I mean, the term everything as a service can be a little bit catchy, some people find, right? Because what do you mean by everything? But essentially, we've all been very familiar as consumers with some of the subscription models out there. You could think of Netflix, in a very consumer-oriented way, has created these subscription models. But really, everything denotes, software as a service, hardware as a service, data as a service, platform as a service. There's many flavors of as a service. So we wanted to be all inclusive in thinking through how do you bundle products, software, and services together. And in some cases, it's just the device and software. Some cases, it's device, software, and services. There's many configurations. We'll kind of go through the ins and outs of it in just a second. But essentially, it's that bundling that we're going to be talking about. And what happens when you sell a device beyond the one-time sale, right? And how do you think about charging for value in new ways? That's essentially the topic that we're going to be sort of digging into. And it's going to bring up a number of options that aren't available to when you have a MedTech company that just sells a product as a one-time sale, right? I mean, there's sort of recurring revenue. You can charge for the use of that product through a subscription, through a consumption model. There's just many different flavors, and that opens up a way to really capture revenue and margin in new ways. It's oriented towards OpEx instead of CapEx. That has major implications for MedTech customers, given the financial difficulties that a lot of health systems, for example, are facing, right? Where it really does matter whether you can charge it one time up front versus spreading out the cost through time. So we're going to get into all the ins and outs of that in just a second, but there are just a multitude of reasons why this is really taking off in MedTech. We're actually going to show you some examples of some of the research and benchmarking that we've done on this topic. But so in order to get us started, maybe Jordan, you can kind of start to think about or sort of illustrate how this is playing out in MedTech, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, no, thank you, Pedro. As Pedro alluded to, right, just the great overview, right? But just to kind of continue that train of thought and highlight a few more features of what we mean by everything as a service. You're really allowing that flexibility of a customer to flex up and flex down. So in the old world, right, I'll call it the old world, the capital sale, the financing world, right, where if there's a hardware-centric offer, we are very focused on maximizing order value, right? And maximizing that order value for that one-time sale, get them, sell as many widgets as you can, right? And maximize the total value. But as we start to pivot towards everything as a service, you're starting to think about maximizing the value that you're delivering and the long-term relationship. So instead of order value, for example, or widgets shipped, you start to think about metrics to measure this business of customer lifetime value. So what is the total value that customer relationship is bringing, not just that point in time, but over time, right? What is and that might be to start. You only have, I'm just using a provider as an example, right? You only have, 100 patients. So you only need, X number of widgets or devices. But as you grow, we'll grow with you, right? It's not more of a conversation of, hey, what are you projecting out in 5 years or whatever the useful life is, right? And they have to buy all that up front because they know they need to grow into it. It's more of, hey, we'll grow with you, right? And you're really going to start to align that cash outflow with the cash inflow, the reimbursement model, of course, but also really how they use it. And then that's where we get closer to value delivery, right? And outcome-based approaches, and really tying that, as I mentioned, that cash outflow or the value that they're getting with how they're paying, right? And so here, this slide a little bit brings to life the difference in nature and how you approach that relationship, right? On the left, it's kind of very sequential. And I kind of provided that overview of, from left to right, it's very regimented. Whereas as we shift to the left and the right, is in everything as a service, it's really a cyclical relationship, right? And as you get to use and you come around, you go to renewal, right? And when you do this right, that conversation, right, as you reach the end of your initial contract is really around value and how you can increasingly do that value. So you really have to structure yourself to think about how you deliver that value to the customer. So there's new concepts such as customer success, right? New roles potentially where you're working with them to make sure that value is continuously being realized by them, right? Another example that comes to mind is as you work with them, you start to see their usage patterns and how they're using and interacting your offer. And what you could potentially do is look at similar customers that have a similar footprint or similar like value base that they're using that offer for, and perhaps suggest some different adoption or different applicabilities in how they can use and leverage the most value out of that offer. And really, so it's that partnership mentality as opposed to that one-time sale mentality. So we're really focusing on customer outcomes.
And Jordan, you're allowed to have access to that data because your devices are connected, right? I mean, that's sort of one element of this puzzle that is sort of very much front and center, is these connected devices that are continuously giving you access to data about usage, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's definitely a big, as these devices come online, right? You're building more interactive software potentially, right? You're providing reports. You're really like utilizing that data, not only internally, right? For how to make your products better, right? That continuous innovation cycle, but also giving that back to them, right? And allowing them to see that data-driven insight as well as that data-driven decision-making that you'll be able to do. And that's part of the ongoing value that you're delivering. And you should charge for that, right? Like no longer do you just have to collect up front and expect it to, to kind of, continue to deliver value over time. You're actually getting charged in real time. And typically, right, that will command a premium over time, right? Which as you scale and as you grow, like that will also contribute to higher margins as well. Especially as we've seen, as we get to some of the business trends here, hardware margins are getting squeezed, right? A lot of healthcare organizations are really thinking about patient-centric solutions, right? You can kind of see some of the numbers here. 88% of healthcare organizations are prioritizing those customer-centric or patient-centric initiatives. And data allows you to do that, right? 85% of our healthcare providers really believe that medical devices with digital health platforms are going to help get them to improve those patient outcomes. So providing that seamless data-driven approach is going to be key. Right. And Pedro kind of alluded to it, but I'll kind of unpack it a little bit more. We are also seeing, with the pandemic, there were a lot of cost pressures that were kind of ushered by increase in cost for doctors and nurses, of course. But now we're seeing kind of the follow-on of that. We're seeing inflation. We're seeing continually high interest rates. So as we look at the future, right, and providers are starting to look at their hardware refreshes, right, their device refreshes, and really taking a hard look at their suppliers and their procurement policies. These types of solutions and offers are growing in popularity because it helps them relieve some of that near-term costing pressure, right? They don't have to sign up for a 9-10% financing rate, right? They don't have to, come up with that money up front potentially. You can kind of spread that over time and continuously deliver value and then grow with them, right? And you may be asking yourself, right, well, I need to capture a lot of that money up front, and I might be at risk, at the beginning if I'm deploying, more hardware or providing them more value. But there are ways to structure the contract in order to make sure that you're maintaining that profitability and growth, as we mentioned, that we can talk about a little bit later as well. And the last one is this is also a global issue, right? We are seeing a lot of first movers in the US, certainly, but there's also more interest globally, especially from nationalized health systems. They're getting more open to these types of models and starting to look at how they procure and some of their policies to start to morph them a little bit to be more open to some of these models and explore them as possible solutions that they can take onto their nationalized systems as well. So if we can transition to the next slide, John. One of the things that we started figuring out, and as Pedro alluded to, we started focusing on this in earnest within MedTech in the last 18 months or so. We did, John, Pedro, and I did write a white paper to start to unpack a little bit of this. And what we found was that X as a service, everything as a service, was a very tech-focused industry term, right? It kind of evolved from SaaS, which was software as a service, the subscription, all that stuff. And then over time, as we started to bundle those hardware, software things, it became the X, everything. So seems like a catch-all. To Pedro's point, but what we really kind of centered around and what was effective within MedTech was really thinking beyond the device, right? So there's the physical device, of course, but then what is that ecosystem or platform play that you can put around it, right? And we start to think about how do you serve the engaged customer, right? So customers now are very interested, or patients are very interested in their data. Can you get that in the hands of them more quickly, either through an app, right, or whatever it is their health data after all? And we're seeing much more interest in how they can use that data. We all have our Apple Watches, our Whoop devices on that we're measuring everything at all points in time. So can we start to facilitate with the devices that are being used to deliver care some of that transition we're seeing and interest we're seeing from patients, right? So you'll see other trends that we're seeing, the care anywhere, everywhere, right? We're seeing a lot of procedures, a lot of care being pushed down outside of providers into ASCs, alternative sites of care, and very soon into the home, right? So how can we get in front of that, right? Using that data to empower not only those individual patients, but also enable that trend and really drive some of the cost to deliver care down as it gets more distributed across many sites, right? And then that thinking beyond the device, right? Really, that it's a mind shift as well, right? So how do you think about product or outcome or service centricity as opposed to just device centricity. What does that experience look like? You'll notice, we use a lot of terms experience, right? How are you delivering that overall experience? And that could be, providing those insights, as we mentioned, but also how you interact with them. Common touch points, doing that customer success, providing them feedback on how they're using the device, how they could do it better, providing training, right, with your experts on, have you thought about using, our offer this way, or layering in some of these new capabilities that could be an upsell opportunity as well, right? So you have to start to think about how you segment some of those things as well.
Yeah, and Jordan, this is a big mindset shift. I mean, you mentioned the mindset shift. I mean, it's a big deal, right? Because our industry has been very accustomed to being rightly proud of very sophisticated hardware, devices and equipment, and just selling it, and just sort of saying, I'm done, I'm not going to go on to the next sale. But this is really about an overall lifetime customer value and experience, right?
Totally. No, totally. And that's actually a good segue to our next kind of slide here. It's really, we tried to juxtapose the from and the to, right? So Pedro hit the high notes on many of these, right? So we're going, those expanded offerings from that device-centric one-time sale approach to that beyond the device, thinking about the ecosystem. How do we deliver that continuous value? Really, shifting from one time and upfront to recurring, right? How do you facilitate that ongoing relationship, right? And drive value, but then also obviously get the payment for it, right? How do you structure that, that cash outflow, as I mentioned, right? The payment structure, so that it more aligns to that value. Really thinking about, are there new opportunities to expand your customer base, right? So there's traditional B2B, but is there a new B2C market, right, in your given space? Are there new buyers, even across the provider ecosystem, right? Some of the things that we're seeing as well, right? What legacy was sold to, just a doctor, just a nurse. Now you might have to bring in IT into that conversation, the CFO into that conversation, and actually bring them all together, and procurement at a single table, because you're actually addressing the needs across all four of them now. And we're seeing in the provider ecosystem that is an unnatural buying process right now, but they're seeing the value more and more and are willing to then meet you there, right? And they're actually, we're getting requests from providers as well of like, hey, we see that this is a way to manage our margin, right? Is there different ways that you'll work with us, right? Beyond the quote unquote traditional financing methods that we can do that, right? And this is kind of modernizing those delivery methods as well. And really, at the end of the day, it's an ecosystem, right? So it's the hardware, it's the software potentially, right? Thinking about how you deliver that value, deliver that data, right? Maybe through a software layer. There could be some interaction, right? Some customer experience that can be delivered, via digital channels. So really thinking through what those complements and ecosystems can look like as the world continues to evolve.
And I do see some questions coming in. We'll definitely get to as many of them as we can as we get through the discussion. But maybe John, you can give us a sense of what we're seeing in the marketplace with our benchmarking.
Exactly, perfect, and thank you, Pedro. And I think just to Jordan's point, right? So there's this broader shift that we're seeing. A lot of questions we get is, so it's very clear that that's, it's happening, in kind of the software space, but where is it happening in MedTech? Where are we seeing these models start to materialize? And the key thing that we typically look for is, how are different players in the market monetizing their offers, right? And so we've kind of put together a framework, right, where you start kind of on the very left-hand side with what, is kind of your traditional capital sale. As you move further to the right, you start to get to more and more innovative models and what we would call true as a service, right? So the, alternative financing is something that's been in the market for quite some time now. There's a number of third-party providers who are kind of working with companies to provide financing options. And then there's also kind of this pattern around operating leases. What we would consider to be kind of true as a service is everything after that. And so just kind of, within that, there's a number of situations where we're seeing companies are starting to offer fixed subscriptions. That can either be software as people think of most commonly, but also hardware. And so you can offer, a device or kind of what would typically be a capital sale on a subscription basis. and offer kind of hardware as a service. Then you start to see this concept of volume-based subscription. Where we see a lot of that is, especially as there's kind of this a growth of consumables, for example, right? And so subscribing to a certain amount of consumables on a given time frame, and then that's kind of the subscription model that you're paying for, right? More advanced than that starts to get to a usage-based type model. And this is an area where Intuitive in particular has kind of really built a brand around with their Da Vinci robot kind of doing a per procedure basis pricing, right? And so that's you can have kind of a combination of software and hardware all embedded into this device, and what you're actually monetizing is every procedure. And then finally, and this is more at a pilot stage, I would say within the medtech industry, just in general, is kind of this outcomes based. For many for many companies, this is kind of the holy grail, but just from what we're seeing in the market, it's still relatively nascent. However, there are companies, as you're seeing on here, that they're starting to think about that and starting to pilot out what could the right construct be to offer outcome-based pricing.
And the outcomes-based pricing models, John, really are going to be very dependent on the data, right? We keep talking about data, access to data. Well, here's where the rubber meets the road, right? I mean, you really need that data to really go at risk for some of these contracts, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's the data, and then just getting kind of the nitty-gritty behind the risk sharing arrangement. And a lot of times, with the vendor taking on more of the risk up front to convince their potential customer that it could make sense, and then kind of and then the customer starts to take on more risk later on.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the risk. And there's a couple of questions that have come on about that risk. We'll get to that in a sec. But okay, what else can you tell us about some of these?
And so just to kind of again paint a picture of the landscape, and I'm not going to drain this slide by any means. I am very well aware there's a lot of information on here, but what we've done from a benchmarking perspective is really just take a comprehensive look at where are all the different offers that are being combined and kind of being delivered under as a service models. And just as we did this overall scan of the product portfolios of some of these different medtech companies, a couple of things that kind of jumped out at us, right? So the first of all is software, right? And so that is increasingly an area that's table stakes. Customers are expecting their medtech providers to provide either embedded or platform software along with the devices. And so many of the leaders in the market are kind of moving towards that model. There's also kind of this concept of moving beyond the device. And so that is both, software itself, but also the value-added services and kind of putting together a well-structured and well-thought-out value-added services portfolio is increasingly one of the key differentiators, especially as many of these, medtech companies are, as Jordan was alluding to earlier, focusing on new buyers like IT, right? And so making sure that you have the right level of value-added services to effectively speak to IT, infosec, cybersecurity roles kind of in the hospital, right? And then as you can kind of imagine, the more the more well-defined as a service models like software as a service are more prevalent in the market. And as we're kind of talking about things like outcome-based, we're starting to see examples of it, but that's more of a white space area. Good. And so there's and I saw some of the questions in the chat, right? That now speak to, okay, so broad awareness that this exists. We can definitely see that it's happening in the market, but how do we think about getting there, right? And so we've put together, and this is kind of a tried and tested framework that we've spent over a decade maturing in the tech space, and are now kind of applying it into the med tech space of how a company can both transform and then scale as a service models, right? And it kind of goes top to bottom, right? So you need to start off by thinking about what is the overall business strategy behind moving to as a service. In the med tech space, typically you're not going to be transitioning your entire portfolio. So what piece of your portfolio do you want to transform? Why? And which are the key customers that you're going to focus on?
And those upfront questions are very important, right, John? Because you're not trying to do everything at once. be very choiceful about where you start to dip your toe into as you think about as a service, right? I mean, and be very choiceful about picking and choosing the offerings, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And as I'll get into in the slide right after this, it is a very comprehensive transformation that you're making, or it's there's a lot that needs to happen to run and scale these offers successfully. So you need to be very targeted about what you're going to focus on, right? And to achieve that level of being targeted, we use a framework around business models, and so that's kind of making sure we're very clear on what are the specific products, who are the customers, what are the monetization models that we're going to start with. And again, kind of going back to some of the research that we shared, typically starting with, monetization models that are more well-defined, and then gradually moving up to the more complex ones. And then, behind all that, kind of the thing that makes this all work is making sure you have the right capabilities, and then just the underlying technology platforms, especially as you're trying to scale these offers up. So typically you can pilot, and run a lot of that on a relatively manual basis. But the moment that you're trying to achieve scale, you need to have the right technology platform behind it.
Yeah, and that involves, not just on the technology side, capabilities on the technology side that you would imagine need to be there, but also how do you incentivize your sales team to sell these things, right? Because they're selling something different or in a different way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's many considerations, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly it, and so when we talk about capabilities, what do we mean by that, right? And so that's a combination of both policy, process, and systems changes that you would need to enable a recurring offer. And so one of the things, again, given the experience we have doing this, we have a pretty strong point of view already at kind of where are capabilities that'll have major impacts if you're transitioning to as a service models. And you can see kind of the heat map here, right, kind of calls out some of those. And just to give the overview, right? So the first kind of row around that idea to offer, your packaging and pricing is going to be an area that's going to have significant impacts if you're moving from one time to recurring. Similarly, around kind of acquire and grow the customer, a lot of that is your lead to cash backbone. And so just, transitioning how your lead to cash platform works from a one-time to recurring sale, that requires a lot of new capabilities like subscription management, and then enhancement to existing capabilities like order management, right? And then when you get down to manage the enterprise, to Pedro's point, right? Things like sales compensation, right? The way that you compensate your reps, when it's no longer about them getting a big upfront capital sale and shifting them over to getting kind of an annuity payment, essentially, that's profoundly different. And so that takes a lot of thinking as to how you want to design it and how you want to manage the change.
Yeah, and John, let's double click on this, because there's a couple of questions that have already been discussed about how do you bring people along in the rest of the organization, not just the commercial team, but your legal team how do you think about risk in some of these contracts? How do you think about the regulatory overhang that is involved with thinking through some of these new ways of selling your equipment and devices, right? I mean, there's a whole host of change management and risk discussions that need to take place, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly right, Pedro. And I think the biggest lesson that we've learned, having worked with clients kind of going through these transformations, is that it needs to be a broad tent approach, and so it cannot just be the commercial organization decides they're going to introduce it as a service model and goes with it. There needs to be kind of this comprehensive look across, both the commercial organization, to be honest, the product organization, right, to build those product capabilities, and the enabling functions like legal and compliance. And they all need to be brought along for the journey as you're designing and kind of thinking about the change management for the transition, not after the fact.
Right. Like, for example, your CFO or your chief accounting officer, right, Jordan, has to be, completely on board with the way you're going to actually accrue revenue here, right?
Absolutely. Accruing revenue is a big where the asset sits, right? As we talk about more OpEx oriented, transfer title of assets might not actually go to the end customer, right? To the provider. So what is the balance sheet impact, right? Really helping them think about that and think through it and get comfortable with the model, because to our point, it's new, right? And it's foreign. So if you've been in this industry for 25, 30 years, like that's not a natural thing, right? To start to evaluate. But it's just because it's unnatural doesn't mean that it isn't, a viable option for the future as the world continues to change.
Yeah, and the good news is we have a well-worn, playbook on how to actually do this, right? And it's informed by other industries, but it's also been informed by how we've seen it play out with our MedTech customers, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think as you and just to kind of build on that with a slide like the one I have up, because we've done this many times and we kind of have the scars, we already kind of come in with a pretty good understanding of where some of the challenges are going to be, and that lets us accelerate and provide the right advice when a company's doing this transformation. And just to another point around that came up in the chat, right? So what are the big roadblocks that come up when companies are trying to make these transitions? What do they need to focus on, right? One of the things that goes back to what Pedro was mentioning is it always comes back to prioritization, right? Making sure that rather than thinking about how do I build up a lot of infrastructure and then see if there's demand, instead test a pilot offer in the market, make sure the demand pattern exists, and then build up the infrastructure behind it, right? So there's some of these other ones, right? The dependencies piece, it's as we were talking about, if you're just focused on the commercial organization and not the enabling functions, that's also going to create a lot of challenges, especially in the MedTech space, given the regulatory compliance, considerations. And so making sure that those, that the whole organization is brought along for the journey. To that point, right, there can be a lot of resistance to change, and so it's really important that there's a top-down kind of mandate that this is something that is kind of what we have a vision for. There's all the top-down support that we need, and there's very clear communication as to how we're going to roll it out, right? And that kind of ties into the piece of accountability, is making sure that it's made clear to the leaders in the organization that there is a point person who's kind of the point person for your as a service transformation, and they and kind of the folks in their organization are holding that accountability. Right. And so just to kind of touch on, and then so given those are many of the challenges that come up. So what is it that we do to make sure that we're able to mitigate those challenges, right? And again, it starts, just by being really clear up front. What is the strategy? Where are you going to start first? And then kind of what are the business models that you're going to prioritize given the wide range of different options that exist, right? Then you want to be thinking about, given the specific business model we decided to focus on, what are the capabilities we need to support those models? And then what is the underlying operating model to operate those capabilities? After that, that's when you start to think about, okay, now how do I get the infrastructure in place to scale it? And that's kind of where you get into the target state technology. And then as you're starting to run these pilots in the market, getting back results, making sure that you're communicating broadly throughout the organization, the wins that you've achieved, and kind of building momentum.
So John, I think, John and Jordan, we've covered a lot of terrain here in a very quick fashion. Why don't we talk a little bit about some of the questions that have come up around? I mean, we've sort of touched on change management, bringing people along on some of the other functional specialties. How do you get started? Like, if you have no as a service offerings to begin with, you're just selling the traditional way. How do you actually get started? Like, what are some of the first things you need to think about? What are some of the first steps? Maybe John, if you can answer that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think it to me, right, the focus is always on the customer. And so typically the reason you're even going to start thinking about this is there's been some rumblings of demand, from potentially your sales organization around, provider is starting to think about or has asked for, an as a service offering. And so then it's from those kind of signals of demand, thinking through what does that look like in terms of just an overall business model, and then how do I create kind of a very lightweight pilot approach to test out, right? Is just one account interested in kind of buying this particular offer and under this model. If I can kind of prove that out, then I start to scale it up. So it is really just about making sure that you're starting very small and then kind of growing from there.
So and you're looking at your existing product lines and saying which ones are going to be potential candidates for
Mm-hmm.
Twitch. And, you know, wouldn't you say that one of the first things is, are any of these devices connected?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
Are
I
we
think it's
able
a
to tap?
good,
Right?
is assuming that you have like there's a, you know, assuming that, you know, from a product maturity perspective, that if your product roadmap is going in the direction of connected devices or is going the direction of kind of software platforms, typically the models you want to monetize those under are as a service base. And so then, you know, the kind of the direction of your product roadmap can also guide the types of monetization options.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to add to Pedro and John, the thinking that customer centricity is key, but
Mhm.
also remembering, right, that you're also going to be continuously getting feedback from your customers. So when you go out and pilot, right, you have hypotheses, you've obviously gathered data, you've gotten feedback to John's point, but you also need to be nimble, right, and potentially mold, right, or change or that, you know, different features or a different way of positioning it because you're going to be getting that real-time feedback. So ensuring that you have that feedback loop and you're able to respond relatively quickly, right, to the market and continuously innovate around the offer construct is going to be key as well. Because, you know, just like a startup mentality, you're probably not going to get it right the very first time, but you'll get there, right? And you want to make sure that you have the capabilities and the expectation of kind of that norming and storming, if you will, you know, as you get it right.
And, you know, and some of that feedback loop is going to be enhanced also, you know, just by the knowledge of your sales teams. You know, there's the sales teams going in, they know these customers very well already, and they're able to sort of create a tighter feedback loop. Can we talk a little bit about that, the sales team and how life changes for them in this SaaS world?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, to me, there's two big shifts that typically occur, right? One of them is actually less about, you know, the business model itself and more about what is being offered, you know. And so a lot of what is triggering these conversations around as a service is the fact that, you know, as we've been talking about, medtech companies are increasingly building and commercializing software, right? And so that right there, you know, it's separate from monetization, but just the fact that that's a pretty new type of offer is something that a lot of times the traditional sales force is not as well equipped to be able to sell in the market, you know. And so they're used to selling kind of these hardware boxes, and now they have to start thinking about software. And so there's a lot of enablement and kind of, you know, potentially you know, new blood that is necessary to address that.
Yeah, like if we go back to slide 10, for example, I mean, there's, you know, just under the sales you know, function, there's a number of major, I mean, that one looks pretty lit up in terms of right, because it's no small feat, right, to as you think about, as you're flying this plane and reconfiguring it at the same time, making sure that you're bringing them along on this journey. It's often missed that's going to be part and parcel, and it's going to include training your customers too, right?
Yeah. And I think, you know, and what was a learning for us, as at least like for Jordan and I, as we've kind of made this move into MedTech, you know, in our kind of traditional you know, software and hardware world, you know, the core offering typically, you know, was the software. So that was something that was well understood. It was more just how do you sell it on a recurring basis. Now it's both, you know, learning how to sell software and then also learning how to do it in a recurring way. And so that's why you see so many of these the boxes under sales are kind of that you know, the capabilities with major impacts.
Yeah,
And that includes
go ahead, Jordan.
And that includes rethinking roles, right, and responsibilities, as well as incentives. John, to your point as well, like, you know, the example that I use, right, the concept of customer success. Like, yes, there's an initial sale, but you also need to incentivize that recurring sale, right, that renewal, that upsell, that sort of thing. And typically, right, that's a different motion. It's a different muscle, and you want to make sure that yes, you have those folks that are focused on that. Also, that you're incentivizing it through comp and those sorts of things. So those are the things that you have to move, you know, hand in hand. It's not just that business model innovation, but also the incentivization and org structure of your sales org to bring that together for success.
Yeah, because you can put the most beautiful business model on paper, but it's getting the, like, mobilizing the sales engine behind it. That's also a pretty profound thing you think through, you know.
Yeah, and so to the earlier Q&A question around, what do you prioritize? Well, here it is. Here's the dashboard that starts to tell you where to prioritize. Now, legal and regulatory has also come up on the question, right? I mean, you're shifting a little bit or in some ways a lot of the risk, right? Because you're, as a vendor, you're actually managing that equipment. What can you say about regulatory overhang and risk, legal risk? When you think through everything as a service types of models.
Yeah, I mean, Pedro, my initial reaction, right, and as going through this, right, there's obviously hesitancy whenever there's innovation, right? Whenever there's innovation, there's uncertainty, especially from a legal and accounting, right? By nature, they're conservative, right? So there's always initial pushback. Like we have not done that before. There's unknowns, all of those sorts of things. There's certainly more, regulations and things that we need to think through, but there are levers that we can pull, right, in order to organize, or I should say, craft an offer to maintain, within those kind of regulatory environment. For example, when we got started in this, we started getting feedback around, anti-kickback statute and AKS and how we position that and that sort of thing, right? But we can develop the structures from a contracting perspective, a payment perspective, right, to align the incentives and the appearance of getting anything for free and that value transfer, right, is very aligned contractually. So there's levers that we've kind of perfected and tailored, right, from our playbook in tech, as we mentioned. Beyond that as well,
and you can charge for taking on some of that risk, right? I mean,
right.
Part of the value enhancement elements of this is that, hey, you've actually shifted risk to us, the vendor, so we're going to charge you something for that transfer of risk, right? I mean, the fact that we need to train people, the fact that we need to have traceability, and I mean, it came up in the questions, but it's something that you need to think about. How do you charge for that value that you're now delivering to that client, which is you took some risk off their table, right?
Totally. And as we know too, regulators are always kind of catching up, right, with the business model innovation. So, as this becomes more pervasive, as the industry moves in this direction, a lot of these macroeconomic factors, right? Like we're going to be lobbying on both sides to help kind of think through how to make this work for all, right? Because at the end of the day, we all have the same outcome in mind, which is improving the patient experience and the patient outcomes. And if we can help tell that story, right, and get there with that risk share model, right, to deliver the best care, over time, we're going to get our incentives are aligned and we'll start to, get more comfortable with these types of models.
Right. Now, when you think about paying for some of this stuff, you mentioned that there's a lag in some of the government entities that are involved in this. Medicare, for example. How do you reimburse for this new way of delivering value? What can you say about that in terms of how do you charge for something like this in a new way, or embedded in the way you charge for it and get reimbursed from Medicare, for example? I mean, Jordan or John, if you want to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think two things. One is like the reimbursement model today, right, is the reimbursement model, right? And I think, what we're trying to do is, if you think about the end customer, right, in most of MedTech industries, is the provider, the ISC, right, the alternative care clinics, they're using these devices for care delivery, right, whatever that may be. They're typically right now getting reimbursed. So they have to obviously submit for reimbursement, procedure-based, whatever that may be. But what we're, starting to dip our toe into and further align those business models one-to-one, meaning, and what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that, that cash outflow can be now closely aligned to how you're getting reimbursed. So the timing of which is not as delayed, right? You don't have to have as much, upfront capital to finance or to provide upfront and then be catching up from a provider's perspective, right? So yes, we're there's still that reimbursement model at its core, but as we mentioned as well, we believe, right, and we're just kicking this off as kind of evangelizing this throughout the industry, that as folks get more mature in their thinking and regulatory bodies get more accepting of kind of the value-based delivery and all of that risk share model, we do believe that there will be more pathways to reimbursement or monetization approaches. But we're still testing that and seeing how that's going to evolve. And we can see it evolving, hopefully, more and more over the next, 12 to 24 months plus.
Right. And John, it'd be great to get a sense, we keep sort of referencing the new ways to contract and new thing. I mean, the whole configure to quote part of the equation is really critical, right? Because if you mess up there, it has downstream effects throughout. I mean, is there anything you would sort of highlight as must-haves on that front?
Yeah, and I think, and I mean the tricky part with the contracting is, typically you are, you may have an existing kind of base of contracts already, and you also need to kind of redesign your contract templates to be including some of these different recurring options. I would say the good news is that many of the companies that we've worked with have the concept of recurring in contracts already through things like service contracts. And so that's an area that you can kind of expand on kind of that service contract template to add additional types of recurring offers within it, and you can use that as a starting point, right? And then just when we talked about kind of where to start too, it's thinking about where are potential customers that are at the end of a particular contract life cycle, so that you can design this new recurring contract, get them on that, and then use that as kind of one of your pilot accounts.
Right. So there's natural points in time that are more suited for this type of conversation than others, right? As you mentioned, those transition points when you already can anticipate some contracts coming up that are going to need to be renegotiated, and maybe there could be a way to do it in this manner.
Exactly.
Can you say a little bit about the manual processes involved versus the automation that hopefully will happen eventually once you get some of these systems going? Because I think that's another element that's sort of opposite, right?
No, 100%, and it's there certainly is the way to put it is that in a recurring model, the transaction volume increases significantly. And why is that, right? When you're selling something on a one-time basis, once you've done the sale, like that transaction is complete. If you're selling it on a recurring basis, there's not only kind of a renewal event that happens periodically, but there's typically other events like an expansion, an upsell, etc. Every one of those things now needs to be managed. And so that creates a significant increase in the transaction volume. And then that goes to Pedro's point as to why there may be a greater degree of manual effort. That being said, initially, and that's the point. Like so that being said, right, it's what's really important is to get a sense of what is the level of demand that you're seeing, because even if there is a greater degree of manual effort, that many times can be handled initially, just to make sure that you're able to to pilot your offers and gain traction in the market. Once and then you start to gain, there's more and more kind of a return if you would invest in these systems to automate those transactions.
That's great. And can you say a little bit about either of you say a little bit about sort of how do you create a platform-based model so you can accommodate some of these current realities, future reality? What can you say about the platform itself?
And I would so to me, right, when you say platform, I would break it down into two things, kind of the product platform and then the underlying lead to cash platform, right? From a product platform perspective, the reason we talk about business models is because we want to make sure that you're designing your offers so that you're not building a single product platform for every offer. You want it to be a one platform for many offers, and therefore you want to think about, I want to offer, call it subscription, software as a subscription. I can build a product platform that has capabilities to support many different types of subscription software offers, right? And then similarly with kind of your lead to cash platform, you're looking to say, to support subscription software offers, I need advanced subscription management capabilities. And so I'm building that capability out that can support many different offers. And that's kind of how you start to think about the platform-based approach to both, support new offers in the market and then help scale them up.
Great. And Jordan, I think you wanted to answer one or two questions on the chat that I want to make sure we get.
Yeah, it was just going through and making sure we were addressing many of them. I think, one we can potentially discuss too is like, what are the common biggest pitfalls in going through an as a service transformation? In what we've learned. I think, that one definitely want to address. I think what we've learned most, and we have a slide for that. So you want to walk through this, John, real quick? Then we can answer that.
We walked through it earlier, but is there anything else that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah. So I mean, from my perspective, I think John touched it, like start small, right? So pilots are key, right? Like, you don't want to go conquer the world, right? And you don't want to go take on too much, right? Because as we mentioned, right, there's a lot of new capabilities throughout your organization, all the way from, right, your offer design, right, and legal approval and all of those things to even get the offer, right, created and everybody aligned on how you're monetizing, and then all the way as it flows through that transactional life cycle, right? The selling process, the delivery process, ongoing delivery process, right? And ultimately accounting as well. So really starting small is I think the key. So pitfalls would be taking on too much too early, right? I think another one that we've discussed, right, is going and building all of those capabilities before you've tested the market, right? You don't need to go make a huge upfront investment in technological capabilities and all those sorts of things, more from like that lead to cash cycle John just mentioned. Yeah, yes, on your product side, right? Because you're going to need to deliver the experience, right? There's certainly investments there because you're going to want to make sure that your customer is getting what they need out of it, and they're wanting more, right, as an end result, so they continue to expand or be an evangelist, right, to others as you continue to pilot this. So like that's where those investments are key, right, and that is experience elements and really that value delivery element. And then you can kind of catch up then, quote unquote, right, catch up with those internal kind of lead to cash processes, if you will.
Yeah.
So I think those are kind of the three biggest that come to mind immediately. John, I don't know if there's anything else that comes to mind for you.
Yeah. What about when you think of these? When you have a private equity company, for example, that had multiple portfolio companies that could take advantage of some of these efficiencies, what would you highlight there? Because I know there's very good models out there on the consumer technology industry side with, I guess Vista Equity is one of the companies. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, because I think there's some synergies here that could be realized, right?
Yeah. And I think that is an area where I think, and if you're kind of approaching this from a PE mindset, you're thinking within a relatively short time frame, where are there areas where I can kind of quickly see some operational efficiencies and benefit from that, And so I think, that's typically the approach. With these type of models, there's an additional value lever you get to focus on, right? Because this is in addition to operational efficiencies, using these kind of models to gain recurring revenue, which is is sticky, and that can create additional value. So I think it's starting to think about if I launch new recurring offers, that's something I can do in a relatively short time frame and start gaining that kind of recurring revenue that is potentially valued higher. And then B, if I do start to see, or if I'm in a position where that is at scale, I can also kind of do a lot of the that lead to cash platform across my different portfolio companies, and then gain operational efficiency in each one of them.
Totally. No, John, it's a good point, and I would add to that, right? In addition to the revenue predictability element of this, right? As we get data, right, and as you have that in the market, it gets harder and harder to switch, right? Because we're talking about value, right? Your continuous delivery. So when they go look at substitutes, right, for your offer, they potentially, right, aren't just looking at one. They have to actually cobble together, multiple offers themselves potentially, right? Or have multiple vendors come in to deliver what you're delivering, right? So thinking about that differentiation, and at the end of the day, that recurring element is highly more predictable, because you got to start to estimate churn rates with higher predictability. And so therefore your revenue kind of planning and then cost and margin planning, right, becomes a higher degree of certainty in what you can expect over the coming quarters or years, which obviously is huge when it comes to a planning perspective, right?
So we have about 5 minutes, maybe one or two questions more. I know we talked about the sales team being integral to this whole process and change. There's a question around like the comp plan. Some examples of ways to structure it in new ways, right? Because that's really at the heart of, at the heart of it, right?
Yeah. And typically what we see, right, is that there does need to be, you know, a transition period, right? So this isn't something you flip a switch, right? But you know, there's kind of both like the carrot and the stick based approach, you know, both you know, increasing the level of compensation or the incentives basically when you're thinking about the recurring component of an offer, and then also kind of thinking about from a quota perspective, you know, is there a certain amount of your quota that needs to come, you know, in a recurring nature, you know? So those are things that you can kind of move toward as leverage, but there is, you know, a transition period where you typically want to, you know, you're over indexing a little bit from a recurring compensation perspective to kind of, you know, sweeten the deal for your reps and convince them to focus on that area.
Yeah, that's a great point. One final question. How are we seeing this play out in other geographies? I mean, the US is oftentimes the lead geography that sort of tries these things out. How are you seeing it play out in Europe, Asia? Jordan, you know?
Yeah, no, I look, I kind of alluded to it earlier, right? The nationalized health systems are becoming more open to these types of models. I think, you know, many providers in hospitals and others, right, are seeing their costs continuously rise, right? So they're looking for budget relief, all those sorts of things. So, you know, these models typically do that, right? And so they're becoming more open. You know, when we talk about tender, when we talk about, you know, competitive bid processes, they're starting to incorporate some of these concepts in those, and become more open to exploring these as the need continuously increases, as these macroeconomic factors continue to you know, to remain consistent, like high interest rates. So that interest is rising. That value-based care, value delivery, you know, making that case for that is continually, you know, evolving, as well as, you know, becoming more of a factor in making some of these decisions. And these models obviously are helping usher in that new future and that new buying pattern.
Right.
And the other pieces, you know, that with the increase in IT buyers and influencers who are, you know, like they're working with many global tech companies who are selling in these kind of recurring models, you know, because they're becoming more important within the MedTech space, they're advocating more and more around the world for recurring models.
Yeah.
And yeah, last point, John, I think you highlighted it, but like, so IT folks are getting more and more comfortable with this because this is how you buy cloud, right? So if an organization is moving more to, you know, putting their infrastructure in the cloud, whether that be compute, storage, and as we all know, everyone needs that, right? So they're kind of ushering in that change, right? And these models are just kind of following in those footsteps, obviously just applying it to different value deliveries.
So your commercial teams will find an ally in the IT department on this topic, but there's others, like John mentioned, the big tent approaches. Don't forget the finance department, the legal department. Everybody needs to be involved in this thinking. But very much appreciate the time, Nicole. I know we're going to make this available to the audience, both the presentation and the recording. Is that correct?
That is correct. And you took some of my housekeeping notes away, so thank you very much for that. Thank you so much, you guys, for your expertise. What an awesome conversation. Obviously, tons and tons of questions, lots of interest on this topic. So thank you for sharing your expertise and your time today. Also, thank you to everyone who joined us live. Really appreciate your time and investment in this topic. And thank you again to Deloitte for sponsoring today's conversation. We cannot put on these great expertise conversations without support from our members like you. So thank you. I encourage you all to go to massmedic.com/events and check out all the other great events we have coming up. And we'll see you next time. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thanks very much, Nicole. Thank you. Bye-bye.